Mozart concerto slow movements are jewels. The middle movement is the expression of sorrow, of bliss, of lyrical aria where the dialogue between the singer, pianist, and the chamber larger ensemble orchestra, winds and strings, are a meditation on idealized life, or on the sorrow of life, or of the hope. There are arias without lyrics, but when you know Mozart's arias in the operas of his, you can almost imagine which ones fit where with the Italian and later German lyrics, because the musical gestures are the leaps, the drops, the tender and the defined and the elusive and the charming and the farewelling. All these gestures are psychologically hinted and suggested, and each of these movements of his concerti for piano that are the middle slow movements are relatively slow. A question of metronome doesn't occur since it was marketed in Vienna only in the 15th year of the 1800s by Melzel. So the andante, the larghetto, the romanze, the markings of the tempo meant slow but moving, which is andante, walking. Except one which is adagio, lament in F sharp minor in a very meditational, sad song, Sicilian style, dotted rhythm. But other than that, most of them are andante or larghetto or so, suggestive of middle movement that in fact shines, in my view, around the first and third movement that are the case of this jewel. That's how I see it. A symphonic introduction very often for the first movement, a piano entering as if uninvited to the feast, introducing itself not by a thematic material that the orchestra profusely presented, the thematic materials, the transitions, the moods, and the general operatic overture mood setting, and then the piano joins them, merges in the traffic of the thematic material, and ornaments, decorates, thematically leads into the slow or less fast second theme, which the art of the transitions of Mozart makes it always magical the way it appears. Not that the tonality is always very far, except in the last concerto where it's in the semitone key of the Neapolitan. That's very unusual. Haydn later in his London sonatas would do the same thing with his slow movement. But Mozart didn't do it for the slow movement in his last concerto. He did it for the development of the first movement. I think that somewhere Haydn, being the former teacher, if that is the real title of Mozart, surviving his young dead student, was influenced by him to write this tonal relation in his E-flat major sonata. But be it as it may, the first movement ends with a cadenza, which is usually improvised, except when Mozart composed it for students or friends or lady pianists who were in vogue, and he wanted to impress them, possibly seduce them. Unrelated, both are possible. But in very many aspects, he didn't trust their improvisatory skills. Therefore, he wrote the cadenzas for them. But for the ones which he premiered on Sunday afternoons in subscription concerts in the Viennese parks, he improvised, of course, the cadenza at the end of the first movement, but he improvised, in fact, the whole piano part throughout, since he composed it in real time with his chamber music friends, musicians of the orchestra group with whom they'll premiere it, and for whom it was a very pleasant gig. All of them being in their instrumentalists' lives composers as well, since that's the musicianship of the time englobed it and didn't separate it in different lanes of musicianship. They could second guess what happened, since it was composed in real time and they were copying the parts of their individual instruments in real time while Mozart was writing the next 8 bars of the landscape size pages of blank music that he filled in. And he filled in the orchestra parts, leaving the piano part blank that he improvised when he premiered, beyond the cadenza. And then if the concerto had success, the publisher Artaria would ask him to send him a score. So then he would fill in weeks or months later the piano part throughout, which is probably not at all the one he improvised. Or perhaps it was a variation of it. After all, improvising was the essence of music making in the past, and the notation was the very small percentage that is left for us to work from. And of course, the decorations, the ornamentations were given as an aspect of the interpretation, which anyway didn't exist as a concept, since he was gathering to read. There was no interpretation separate from composition, since most of the composers were the performers. And in this case, the co-performers with Mozart, who conducted from the piano with the strings on one side of the semicircle and the winds on the other side, with the audience in the back. And most of the left hand initiating the entrances of the different instruments or groups, which is why the Mozart concerti are majoritarily written for right hand on the piano part, which has the aria, symphonic, thematic material, decorative patterns, virtuosic tools of his toolkit of broken thirds, octaves, descending arpeggios with accacciaturas, all his amazing toolkit, in fact. But ultimately, the virtuosity that was displayed was still in the tradition of the concerto grosso with the piano from the Baroque, where the soloist is part of the group with timely reaching out and being the aria of the singer of the group. So it's a combination of symphonic, operatic, string quartetish, woodwind quintetish, chamber music at large with creative pianism that was literally improvised and, when composed, barely rehearsed. In other words, read, rather than rehearsed and practiced and eventually defining an interpretation. There was all in one, encompassed, and everything was written in the themes, in the transitions, in the indications of the meter and the general mood of the genre, if it was a dance, if it was a theme and variations, if it was a form and a genre that was reminiscent of others. All these musicians with whom he played were all in the same musical style of the same Austro-Hungarian capital of Vienna, and Bohemia next door with Prague. Therefore, it was a time capsule of musical intelligence shared together from a common heritage of the Rococo, the still Baroque that evolved into classical, what we call Viennese school, with Haydn's sonata form, two themes, development, recap. And then the third movement would be the rondo, most of the time, with the exception of some with theme and variations, with the ritornello, the ABACAD, and every time you could say that in a modern way, a jazz jam is a bit of the same on a chart where everybody freely in the group improvises within relatively defined, if not obvious, chordal chart. Whenever in the Mozart concerti, improvisatory reading of the piece in concert performance, it was more elaborate because the system didn't only depend on few chords. It was modulations in harmonics, accacciaturas, appoggiaturas, suspensions, all the effects, and all of them relating to other genres on the piano concerto, of which the lyrical aria of operas of the time, obviously. And that's why everything was of the time, because it was written for the moment, on the spur of the moment, performed on the spur of the moment, and forgotten the moment after it was performed. It's not forgotten in the sense that it's ignored, but the next piece had to be given, always fresh fruits, fresh flowers on the market. And the publisher published them in order for amateur pianists who could afford to study music among the elite aristocracy and who had interest in music. Then they would purchase the score to have it and have their protégés play them for them, or even invite the composer to do so. But yes, the music was performed and then vanished in thin air. It's too bad nobody could record the audio or the video, if it were, of the performances of these premieres in the Viennese Park with Mozart on the piano, forte piano. And the subtle tones of that instrument that didn't have today's projection and length of sound and richness of tone and cross-strung structure of the sound boards, strings organization where they resonate by sympathy. The texture of the solo part was blending in a co-blossoming with the other instruments, which were not treated as a mass orchestrally, but with individualities and grouped in harmonic, mostly for the strings, and with various thematic secondary voices for the piano, in the oboe, clarinet, flute, or bassoon, or French horn, though mostly French horns held the harmonic pedal of the orchestration, and the strings provided the vibrato, the pizzicato, the spoken emotion that the bow projects. And so they are complementary, and that's why I call it a larger chamber ensemble rather than a symphonic orchestra in the 19th century aspect of it as we come to know of it. And therefore the later romantic piano concertos having the pianoforte of the modern style in decibels equal an orchestra as an army of one. It's completely changing the aesthetics of the heroism that is brought in through the virtuosity that is enhanced, the power and the speed and the brightness and the capacity of the piano to be an orchestra on their own, with the orchestra not always complementary, but always sometimes and very often actually contradictory and in a battle with the piano. Well, all this in Mozart concerti was not the case. It was a hybrid, as we would say today, between a chamber group and an opera in a symphonic statement for the opener, and a very entertaining, light-mooded, often using themes of Ländler, that is folk songs of the time that people could recognize and hum or whistle when they leave the concert performance. So the idea to write something elaborate and complex while naturally simple in its thematic acceptance by the audience discovering it and able to remember and hum it after. I think Mozart pride himself writing to his father in many letters that he's happy when he hears people in the streets humming some of his arias from his operas, since opera was the main popular entertainment that marked the spirits and the thoughts and the memories of their contemporaries. And since Mozart, thanks to Salieri's jealousy, more or less added by a Russian writer into a story that didn't really happen in the way that Salieri would have wished the death of Mozart, but in a professional way, Salieri being the court composer, he made sure very directly or covertly Mozart not to have a continuous capacity of success through this highest operatic place in the whole empire. And he was popular in the theater for the people, not the court one. I think he proud himself of this, to be a popular composer, probably like film music or pop music today, or video game music or commercial music. Who knows? It's a little bit trivial to consider that so, or even comparing in jazz jam sessions to a Mozart concerto performance at the time. But why not? Audacity is not disrespect. It's mostly to translate my desire to share with you the spontaneity of the music making while of the time of the late 18th century, which reigned there. That means that their level of musicianship individually for whichever instrument they played was being co-composers of the piece, which means that the mistakes in the copying of the handwritten parts written on the spot, which inevitably had mistakes or holes. I mean, today, after centuries, we still have editions of famously played pieces like these with still typos in the publisher's edition because it escaped the vigilance of the proofreaders. And on this day, there was just a premiere of a piece of the day on the moment. And on the moment, I'm sure they corrected in real time discrepancies by guessing it because it was a shared tonal system, it was a shared genre awareness. They all had the same, they basically had the same culture, speaking the same language. Just like people who study Latin, when they study medicine, they recognize each other because they refer to the diseases in Latin, whichever country they study medicine in. So it's a lingua franca of the knowledgeable ones. And in this case, it was just the exchange of musicianship between musicians. And I find that the slow movements extracted from their shell or from their casing, if it were, of the first and third movement, which are stating thematic material symphonically, and in the last movement, enjoying, jubilant, driven, enticing rondo form. The middle movement remained the moment of self-reflective, deeply connected to the soul of the being, to the experience, almost without masks. The formal mask or the dense ballroom mask of the outer two movements. It seems like truths are told here through expressive melodic line and very subtly, suggestively quoted harmonizations, not to mention secondary voices. And it's enough to hear excerpts of few of them to realize how immediately they talk to us about what statement this aria, piano concerto, large chamber music ensemble states. This is the beginning of the slow movement of the concerto in G major, presently in C major for the slow movement, which, by the way, inspired Schumann in his G minor sonata. Reminiscence, recalling, borrowing, in any case, closeness, even if way later than Mozart, when Schumann wrote it. Yes, the first movement is G major. And then the last movement. Typical Ländler, even if he has a minor variation that brings the simple in the complex. And in the middle slow movement after this luminous C major opening I played for you, he has the development or the B section in a D minor, very simple statement, almost withdrawn. And in this case, I think in turn Mozart was into the slow movement of the Italian concerto by Bach, though chances are he didn't know about it since little music of the past was known in the past. This is the section. And the slow movement of Bach's Italian concerto. It's probably a communality that is serendipitous. After all, there are only 7 tones and 5 for the semitones, or 12. So the idea of the combination of them is relatively guessable. That there will be a chance that something will be reminiscent of something else. To us today, more than to them, because today we can compare and contrast. But then, not so much. This slow movement is real meditation of inner well-being. And Mozart always combines the major and the minor, the life and tragic death with the laugh and the smile, tenderness and humanity in his not only talking through his music, probably receiving it already from the upper spheres and relating to them like most of the uplifting music like Bach, for instance, but also the human aspects of our condition of finitude when he finishes with that's what I call the addio moment in the end of his slow movements. In Italian, from his operas, is the farewell, like in the end of the first act of Così fan tutte, so do they all. Mozart expresses here the farewell, even if it's operatically faked in the theater play as well, because the young husbands want to know if their wives will be faithful by faking a departure to the army. And the boat disappears and the young brides cry. And we all know that they'll return disguised to try to seduce their own wives to see if they would be faithful. Okay, this is the 18th century operatic theatrical game of masks, societal, and that goes deep into the human soul and its limitations and desires to reach absolutes when they're only what they are. And so he does have these moments of tender goodbyes that are so believable, as theater is to be. That's the whole point of it, is make believe. And but during the moment you believe in it, rupture of this belief. And this luminous C major slow movement is tainted by these dramatic dark clouds that clear up in minor from into major, sometimes ambiguously in between the two, which I call minor or major, a smile with a tear, but mostly a constant passing from the two moods, the sad and the happy, bit like the ancient Greek theater masks that represent the two states of the mood, desperate and hopeful. And it's interesting because the middle section is rarely contrasting in the slow movement. Is usually the something else B section. Here it's a contrasting, very instrumental G minor bravura-driven drama. And the return is from the dominant into minor as a third degree, back to B flat major, the original key of the slow movement. And he does it by going from 16th notes to triplet of 8th notes to 8th notes by 2. So the art of transitions with Mozart is something he seems to have been keenly indulging in, as if it means so much to him, more than just a functional, formal transition. It has to be something that is return or depart from or return from where you went, that is recomforting and comforting and sometimes surprising and sometimes silly and sometimes reminiscent. So subtle in the innuendos that he does in these transitions that charm us or surprise us, but that we don't remember since, of course, they only have the purpose of what they are. And we remember the themes and the melodic lines. But the first movement of this concerto is in the rare D minor, and another will be rare C minor out of 27, only 2 in minor key principally, concerti by Mozart. And this one is the key of Don Giovanni. each overture you have a scale. That represents the struggle of the soul of Don Giovanni against his horrible behavior of lightness of being and cruelty, while realizing at the same time with his chromaticisms that his soul is forsaken. And Mozart plays in his demonstration of musically of these aspects of the personality of the character of Don Giovanni so fundamentally, strikingly, ambivalently, amazingly. And in the D minor opening of the concerto, you have the syncopations. The breathlessness of the strings with the double bass, sliding, with a rising worry, angst, compared to this I don't know why I'm trying to explain what it is, since Stravinsky said rightfully that music only represents what it is. But we humans associate moods, atmospheres, intents. Why not? At least these are for me the obvious connections, because in the third movement he does the Ritornello's theme with this rising arpeggio, which he'll do in the 40th Symphony. And I think this idea of the rise, as Beethoven will do later in his first sonata, here is, but departing on an upbeat, arriving on a downbeat. Therefore, the slow movement it's like a Contessa aria of happy to be in love before the storm. But this is unusual for a slow movement out of 27 of them to have a contrasting dramatic motion, slow movement, middle section. I like to think that composers who really are composers think first the B section and not the B section as something else section to the thoughtful A section. But that is a side note. Who knows in which order Mozart composed it? Unfortunately, I wouldn't know. Unless I could be a fly on the wall back then and see how it came out of him, as he used to say, dictated by God, since he never wrote, according to him, first drafts. That's also another story. And the other concerto in minor is the C minor concerto. Out of 27, only the second in minor. And it's said in the Gazette of Vienna that Beethoven attended the premiere in this park in Vienna on the subscription concerts. And in the third movement, Mozart composed theme and variations, of which one has the struggle symbolized by the scales. So the Gazette of Vienna mentions that Herr Beethoven stood up and said during the performance, "I didn't come to hear Herr Mozart practice his scales." Now, sounds ironic, mocking, irreverential, arrogant, legendary, who's to know? But factually, some 2 decades later, Beethoven writes his C minor, also same key, third piano concerto, and the opening of the piano is ascending scales, and the theme is a triad. And Mozart's theme is, again, serendipitous coincidence. Redundance even mentioning it, but fact. And the slow movement of the Mozart is in the relative major, which is expected. Somewhere between a string quartet setting and an aria in the same time in the right hand. When Beethoven will write his third concerto, his slow movement won't be in the expected relative major of E flat major, he would be in E major for a C minor concerto compared to the relative major expected tonal combination. And he does it without transition, Beethoven. Whenever later Rachmaninoff, writing his second piano concerto, Dr. Dahl being the psychiatrist who suggested him to write it after he was in depression because supposedly Glazunov conducted drunk his symphony as a student piece of Rachmaninoff and was poorly received. So he wrote a C minor concerto. And his movement number 2, middle slow movement, is in E major, just like the scheme of the tonal system of Beethoven. And in this case, the figuration is more like Bach's first prelude by Rachmaninoff, but with a scheme of the tonal system of C minor, E major, major mediant. Except Beethoven doesn't use a transition, and Rachmaninoff does. Many side notes here. So, to return to the Mozart slow movements, another one I would like to share with you is a C minor slow movement from the E flat major concerto that is commonly called jeune homme, or young man in French, which happened to be the last name of a female pianist traveling through Vienna for whom Mozart wrote it. Mademoiselle Jeune Homme, or Jeune Homme. Not everybody is agreeing on how the name was pronounced in German. The G major I played earlier, the slow movement, was for Barbara Ployer. And in these cases, the cadenzas, like for her and Jeune Homme, were written in the score by Mozart because it was to make sure that they do it right. And he was just improvising it right. Well, in the case of this E-flat major concerto, the middle movement or slow movement is a dramatic C minor. Very reminiscent of the Kyrie of his Mass K427. And this is such a different capacity of emotional grip on the psyche of the listener through the performers, from the luminous to the dark, from the playful to the contrasting. His slow movements are really the mirror of the soul of humanity through his brotherhood of humanity. Mason as he was, it was meaningful to him to be this Mensch, in fact. And in the A major concerto K488, that has the most gentle opening movement, and the most joyful third movement, the only adagio of 27 in the Siciliana rhythm, dotted tom, bottom, pom pattern. His addio here are repeated notes reminiscing of the bells in church announcing the death. Whenever in this E-flat major of the C minor concerto, the addio is to different ways to part operatically, dramatically. It's really a piano opera, the Mozart concerti slow movements.